I'm happy to introduce David Banks as the speaker of this session. David is a professor of the practice of statistics at Duke, where he's been since about 2003. Earlier in his career, David taught at CMU, and he's worked at different government agencies. He's been the chief statistician at the Department of Transportation, and had been at NIST, and been at FDA. He's also been editor of the Journal of the American Statistical Association, served on their board of directors, received their highest award, the Founders Award, a few years ago. Currently, David is the director of SAMSI, the Statistical and Applied Mathematical Sciences Institute in the Research Triangle. So David is probably happy to be here and not in charge of the program. A few years ago, David wrote a book with two co-authors on adversarial risk analysis, and the book won some awards from the Bayesian societies, and that's David's topic today. So, David, pleased to introduce you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you all. I was asked if I wanted to say a few words about Dymax, and yes, Dymax is wonderful. It has touched my life in many ways over a really long period of time, at least 20 years, I think a little longer than that. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to remember one of the people who was involved with Dymax, Mel Janowitz. I met Mel back in the 1980s. Some human beings are naturally warm, naturally humane. They have wisdom and grace and humor, and some of those people are even mathematicians. And Mel carried that forward. And one of Fred's comments this morning reminded me of something Mel told me when I was much younger, and it had to do with your space issues out in, when Dymax was being founded. He said, David, in the federal government, how important you are depends upon how much money you can control. If you work for a corporation, your importance is determined by how many people are underneath you in the table of organization. And if you're in the academic fields, it's how many square feet you control. So, with that in mind, let me just thank Mel for all the wisdom I've gratefully received over the time, and now I want to move forward with my talk. I'm going to be talking about adversarial risk analysis in the context of auctions, and since I only have 30 minutes, I will have to abbreviate some things. But what I want to say is that classical game theory is a notoriously bad model for human behavior. All the behavioral economists have made it really clear that human beings don't think the way game theorists say they should. So what do you do? Well, one could pivot to risk analysis, which is used in statistics. And statistical risk analysis has been around for a really long time. It's not easy, but we understand how to do it. And the problem with that is that most classical risk analysis assumes that your opponent is non-strategic. Your opponent is the weather, or random chance, or just sort of whatever happens. And we would like to try and synthesize these two areas so that we have a method for doing risk analysis that is appropriate for situations in which our opponent is smart. What we're going to do is operationalize an idea that Jay Gedane and Pat Larkey and other people had back in the 1980s and figure out actually how to do what they suggest. This approach is incredibly controversial. I do not like to disagree with Nobel laureates, but sadly, Roger Myerson and I are completely at odds on this. You can read that quote, given time limitations, I won't, but it is his argument as to why this decision theoretic approach to strategic games must be rejected. And I think he is much too hasty in drawing that conclusion, and I will present some alternatives that correspond to other ways of thinking about strategic games. The adversarial risk analysis framework is not the only alternative to game theory that's out there, but it does have some nice advantages, and Greg Purnell and Jason Merrick back in 2011 did a head-to-head comparison of several different strategies for handling strategic games and decided that ARA was the best. And one of the reasons they liked it is that you can partition the total uncertainty in the situation into three components, each of which can be addressed separately. The first component is aleatory uncertainty, and that is the uncertainty in the outcome conditional on the choice made by all the players. So in a two-person game, if I make my choice, Fred makes his choice, then the outcome still may have some randomness to it. Fred may be trying to smuggle a bomb onto a plane. I'm going to be trying to stop him from doing that. Given his decision in mind, he may or may not be successful. That's a random outcome. The epistemic uncertainty concerns what we don't know about the utility function of our opponent, what we don't know about the probability assessment of our opponents, what we don't know about the capabilities of our opponents. Well, not to beat a dead example, but Fred may be an optimist and think that he has a really good chance of successfully smuggling a bomb onto the plane. I may think that he is being over-optimistic on that. He may think, I don't know whether he values bombing an airplane more than a train. These are all things I don't know. That's uncertainty, and that's the epistemic uncertainty. And that epistemic uncertainty would be handled by traditional Bayesian methods in which I have subjective beliefs about what Fred's utilities are. The most interesting one is concept uncertainty, and that's because I do not know how my opponent is trying to structure the reasoning for the game. It may be that my opponent seeks a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, or it may be that my opponent is non-strategic, or maybe my opponent is doing something called level K thinking that we'll talk about in a moment, but basically it's I think that you think that I think, that type of reasoning. So those are three different types of uncertainty that arise in the context of a strategic game, and the adversarial risk analysis approach allows us to address these three parts separately. And let me step back for a moment and say, this is really a very human way of thinking about things. If you were playing chess with your 8-year-old nephew, your 8-year-old niece, you may have an opinion about how well she plays. You model her as looking 2 or 3 moves ahead, and you say, okay, she looks 2 or 3 moves ahead. I'll look 4 or 5 moves ahead. I don't have to think very hard. I'll have a nice game. I'll beat her, and I can trash talk her at the end. And if your mental model for your niece is correct, then you'll have a nice time, you'll win the game, it'll all be good. But if your niece is Judith Polgar, then you're going to get your ass kicked. And that's exactly the way it should work. If you have bad information about your opponent, then you're disadvantaged, and that's a problem. But that is exactly how the ARA approach works here. We build a model for the decision-making process of our opponent, and then we maximize our expected utility against that model. And that's a totally normal thing for human beings to do. It's just that we're going to try and provide a structure for that, and we're going to develop that in the context of auction theory. First, suppose that Daphne is bidding for a first edition of the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And she's the only bidder, but there's a reservation price that is secret, and if Daphne bids below the reservation price, she will not get the item on offer. And so in that case, it's totally dead standard auction theory that she should bid D star, which maximizes the difference between her true top dollar value for the book, D naught, and the bid she makes D, times the probability that a bid of D is above the reservation price. So that's maximizing her expected profit, or in this case, her expected utility. Now we consider a 2-person auction. So Daphne is bidding against Apollo, and 2-person, first price, independent, private value, sealed bid auction among risk-neutral opponents, which we're just going to call an auction because there's a lot of stuff that's packed into that, but it's just the type of auction you might imagine. Now, in trying to do this bid, the aleatory uncertainty arises if neither Daphne or Apollo has been able to examine the book in advance of the auction. So if the book is in terrible condition, then it's going to be worth a lot less than they want. If the book has annotations by John Nash, then it's going to be worth a lot more than they expect. And that's just the random uncertainty conditional on both of their bids. So they make their bids, and then their payback is random. The epistemic uncertainty arises if Daphne doesn't know how much Apollo wants the book. It may be that the book belonged to Apollo's PhD supervisor, in which case it has sentimental value above and beyond the Blue Book value of the book. It may be that she doesn't know how much money Apollo has in his pocket to bid. There are all sorts of things she doesn't know about that, and so those are the epistemic uncertainties. And the concept uncertainty arises because she doesn't know how Apollo is framing his strategic calculation in making the bid that he puts. Perhaps he's non-strategic, perhaps he's using level K thinking, perhaps he's going to seek the classical Bayes-Nash equilibrium solution. So we're going to assume that there's no aleatory uncertainty because it turns out that that's actually a very easy thing to handle. And so they've been able to examine the book in advance, and so that's okay. Daphne knows her true value for the book X naught, and we'll start with the simplest case in which she assumes that Apollo is non-strategic, and one model for a non-strategic opponent is that he's going to bid some random fraction unknown to Daphne of his true value. So he has some true value for the book, which is a random variable to Daphne, and he's going to bid some fraction of that, say about 90% of it, but she doesn't know that either. So she's going to have a subjective Bayesian distribution over the value of the book to Apollo, and she's going to have subjective Bayesian distribution over the fraction that he bids. And if she has all of that, then it turns out that she can develop her belief about the bid that Apollo will make, and then she's going to do the bid D star that maximizes her expected utility just exactly the way she did for the case of the reservation price. But maybe Apollo is more subtle. Maybe Apollo is going to seek a Bayes-Nash equilibrium solution. And in that case, there's a lot of stuff going on here. The classical Bayes-Nash equilibrium assumes that there's telepathy going on, that they have common knowledge, that Daphne doesn't know the value of the book to Apollo, but she has a distribution over that value, and that distribution is known to Apollo. And conversely, Apollo doesn't know the value of the book to Daphne, but he has a distribution over that value, and Daphne knows what that is. And in that situation, if the Apollo's belief about Daphne H sub D and Daphne's belief about Apollo H sub A, if they're equal, then there's a fairly simple closed form expression, and you can work it out for a case of n bidders, and that's again standard auction theory. If it turns out that it's an asymmetric auction, H sub A is not equal to H sub D, then it turns out that you can only work out a closed form solution for the case of uniform distributed values, and that's a very special case. In general, however, a lot is known. If H sub A and H sub D are both differentiable, then there's a unique solution, and that solution is also differentiable. People tried to develop numerical solutions using something called the backshooting algorithm, and subsequently that was proved to be unstable and intractable. Various other people sort of fumbled around in the game for a while, and finally Tim Au developed an algorithm, balanced indifferent division algorithm, the bid algorithm, which is a provable solution to finding numerical solutions for asymmetric auctions. And from an adversarial risk analysis perspective, that common knowledge, that telepathy assumption, is problematic. But if you look at it from the ARA standpoint, it's actually quite natural. Daphne has a belief about the value of the book to Apollo, and that's her distribution for his value. And she has a belief about what Apollo thinks is her value for the book. And so that's completely respectable. There's no reason in the world that that couldn't happen. So we can encode the traditional auction theory assumptions in the AR framework in, I think, a much more natural way. And if we take that as the situation, then we have to solve a set of coupled equations. The bid that Daphne makes is going to be the argmax of the top line there. And since Apollo does not know the distribution of Daphne's value, that means that her true top dollar value is going to be a random variable D star. And that means that the bid that gets made is going to be have a distribution G. And the argmax that Daphne has for Apollo's bid is going to follow a distribution F. And you can see you need F for the first equation, and you need G for the second equation, so that couples things here. Now, in this situation, we can use the bid algorithm to solve that system of equations and develop what Daphne believes is the distribution of Apollo's bid F. And now she steps out of the Bayes-Nash equilibrium framework, and she knows her true top dollar value for the book. She uses her D naught, her top dollar value, and solves that equation and gets the D star solution. For two opponents, this solution is very, very close to the classical Bayes-Nash equilibrium solution. It is not the case when you have 3 or more bidders. And so I'm going to highlight the subtle distinction between Bayes-Nash equilibrium and this solution by calling this a mirroring argument, because Daphne is trying to mirror the reasoning that she thinks Apollo uses and then optimizes her expected utility under that mirroring argument. One nice feature of this is it opens up a whole new class of auction theory games. In auction theory, they just cannot handle the situation in which there are 3 opponents and they don't have the same opinions. So I might believe that Greg is going to bid high. I might believe that I think that Greg's going to bid high. Fred thinks that Greg is going to bid low. That situation is not compatible with any of the standard auction frameworks. But with the ARA thing, we can solve it, and we'll do that in a minute. And in terms of concept uncertainty, we first took Apollo to be non-strategic. Then we imagined that he might use a Bayes-Nash equilibrium concept, and later on we'll be talking about the level K thinking concepts. And it turns out that if I think there's a 50-50 chance that he's going to be non-strategic and a 50-50 chance that he's going to be seeking, say, a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, then, as a Bayesian, I can work out the solution for the non-strategic case, I can work out the solution for the Bayes-Nash equilibrium case, and then I can use a mixture model to combine those. And so I can express very complicated uncertainty about the concept that Apollo is using to solve the game. We won't do that here because it's just messy, but in principle, if you really cared about it, you could do that. Non-strategic, Bayes-Nash equilibrium, mirroring argument, and now level K thinking. If Daphne is a level 0 thinker, then she's non-strategic. If she's a level 1 thinker, then she thinks that her opponent, Apollo, is non-strategic, and she maximizes expected utility against that. If she's a level 2 thinker, then she thinks that Apollo is a level 1 thinker who is modeling her as a level 0 thinker. And you can go up as far as you like in that hierarchy. Empirical studies have shown that human beings rarely get above level 2 thinking, except in the context of very structured games, such as chess. In a chess game, you might think 10 or 15 plies ahead. But in most interactions, people don't really do that. So let us imagine that Daphne is a level 2 thinker. She's modeling Apollo as a level 1 thinker who thinks of her as a level 0 thinker. So her subjective belief is that Apollo assumes that her value for the book has a uniform distribution on $100 to $200. She bids a proportion of a value that is going to be, say, a beta distribution with parameters 10, 1 or something. So she just has this belief that Apollo thinks that she is non-strategic in this way. It's a toy problem just to illustrate that you can do the calculation. This leads her to believe that Apollo thinks that her distribution, the distribution of her bid is going to be y over 200 to the 9th power for y between 100 and 200. Now, Apollo, as a level 1 thinker, is going to maximize his expected utility against that subjective belief. It turns out that he's going to go through an argument like this, and it turns out that this calculation means that Apollo should bid 90% of his true top dollar value, capital A sub naught. Now, capital A sub naught is, of course, unknown to Daphne, but being a subjective Bayesian, she has a distribution over that, and we imagine that her subjective distribution is that Apollo's got a triangular distribution between $140 and $200 with a peak at 170. And since Apollo should bid 90% of his true value, she believes that he will bid a random variable. His bid will be a random variable with distribution that is supported at $126 to $180 with a peak at $153. And finally, if Daphne's true top dollar value for the book is $175, then it turns out that she should bid $161.67 in order to maximize her expected utility in this framework. Toy example, but it's just showing that you actually can work it out for a level 2 thinker, and the reasoning for level 3 or level 4 is just recursive, so there's no real interest there. If you have more than 2 bidders, life gets more exciting. One approach is to go with Bonnie, Alvin, and Clyde. You're supporting Bonnie. we've already talked about this. It's more interesting to imagine that Bonnie is a level 2 thinker. So she believes that Alvin is a level 1 thinker, and she believes that Clyde is a level 1 thinker, and she's going to have to work out what their bids are likely to be. We're going to let F sub ij be what Bonnie thinks player I thinks is the distribution for player j's bid, and G sub ig is what she thinks is what player I thinks about the distribution for player j's value for the book that's being sold. So we'll start off by imagining how Bonnie will examine Alvin. She believes that Alvin will make the bid little a star that is the maximum of his best bid against Bonnie and his best bid against Clyde. That means he's going to be solving those equations there. And here, little a naught is Alvin's true top dollar value for the book, which of course is unknown to Bonnie. But she's a Bayesian, so she has a belief about that. And B sub A is her belief about the value of the book to Alvin. And it turns out that you can go through this level 2 thinking algorithm in which she models Alvin as a level 1 thinker who believes that she's a level 0 thinker, and also who believes that Clyde is a level 0 thinker. And she's going to be able to solve that set of equations there, and she's going to work that out. And there's a book on this subject out there if anybody wants the details. There's also some papers. But the notion is you can use the bid algorithm to solve this problem and get a distribution for A star, the maximum of Alvin's best bid against Bonnie and Alvin's best bid against Clyde. Do the same thing for Clyde, and then she's going to make the bid B star. That's her best bid. It's going to be the bid that maximizes the probability, the expected utility, where she has to find the probability that a bid of B beats both A star and C star, the random bids from Alvin and Clyde. And simply to show that this can be done, oh my gosh, I thought I had fixed this. All right, well, there's missing information here. Bonnie believes that Alvin thinks that her value for the first edition is beta 1,1, and that Clyde's value for the first edition is beta 2,1. Also, she believes that Clyde thinks that her value for the first edition is beta 4,1, and she thinks that Clyde's value for the book is beta 3,1. And then to complete this, you need to have that Bonnie believes that Alvin's value for the book is beta 5,1, and she believes that Clyde's value for the book is beta 6,1. So now we have a completely asymmetric auction in which the players do not have common knowledge or shared beliefs about things. And this is the type of problem that cannot be addressed in classical auction theory. So on the left-hand panel, we have the distribution for A star. So that is Alvin's bid against Bonnie and Alvin's bid against Clyde. And the right shows the distribution of the maximum of A star B and A star C. That is what Bonnie thinks is going to be the distribution for Alvin's bid. There's a numerical instability here. The mesh size wasn't small enough, but trust me, that's continuous and differentiable. The left-hand panel shows the distribution for Clyde's belief about Alvin's bid and Clyde's belief about Bonnie's bid, and the right-hand panel shows the maximum of those two random variables. And now we have the distribution for the bid that is the maximum of Alvin's bid and the maximum of Clyde's bid, and Bonnie's going to bid against that. And in this case, if Bonnie's true value for the book is $0.95, $95, whatever you want to do, just slide the decimal place around, then her optimal bid is going to be 0.7523. So we're able to figure out what is the best strategy for Bonnie under this very unusual situation. You can do the same type of argument for the mirroring equilibrium. So we can move away from the level 2 thinking, develop the analog for the mirroring equilibrium. We can solve the whole thing, and because I am time limited, I will not do that. Instead, I'm going to cut to a punchline. Yes, maximizing expected utility. I'm going to show a table that ties everything together. And this table contains there are 6 pieces of information that you need in order to solve any of these games, whether you're doing it from a Bayes-Nash equilibrium standpoint, classical game theory, mirror equilibrium, level K thinking, and these are the beliefs Apollo's utility, Apollo's probabilities, and Apollo's belief about the distribution of Daphne's actions, and then the same thing in reverse for the other opponent. So this is that table, and so in the top, the row 0, you have Daphne's true utilities, Daphne's true beliefs about what is going to be the outcome conditional on her action and Apollo's, and her belief about what Apollo is going to do. And then you have Apollo's true utilities, Apollo's beliefs about the probabilities of the outcome conditional on their actions, and then Apollo's belief about what Daphne is going to do. And underneath that, we have random variables that are imputed through some sort of mechanism, often a Bayesian subjective distribution. If you're doing traditional game theory, then you need to have cells 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 4, and 0, 5, and you have to assume that these are commonly known to all of the players. If you have a non-strategic adversary, then you need to have cells 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3, and the 0, 3 cell is assessed from either subjective belief or expert opinion or the historical record. This is the case when you're planning for a hurricane, and you want to know what's the probability that a hurricane is going to hit New Orleans. Well, you use historical data and meteorological opinion to try and infer that. If your opponent is seeking a Bayes-Nash equilibrium solution, you need cells 0, 1, 0, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 4, and 1, 5, and it uses those last 4 cells to infer 0, 3. 0, 3, of course, is the tricky one. 0, 3 is the distribution that Daphne has over Apollo's actions, and that drives everything. If she wants to maximize her expected utility, she needs to know what's the probability that Apollo is going to do this, that, or the other. If you are doing level K thinking, then you need cells 0, 1, and 0, 2. That's okay, because these are known to Daphne. These are her own beliefs and opinions. But the level 1 analysis requires cells 1, 4, 1, 5, and 1, 6, and uses those to produce 0, 3. If you're doing level 2 thinking, you need cells 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3. That will give you cell 1, 6, and then with 1, 4, and 1, 5, you produce the 0, 3 cells. That's the hard one. And if you're doing the mirror equilibrium solution, then you use cells 0, 1, 0, 2, and then you have some consistency conditions that will ultimately produce the 0, 3 cell. And the main message here is that game theory, however you do it, is really hard. There aren't any real mathematical shortcuts that make it easy, but the adversarial risk analysis approach is comparable to what is currently done, and seems to involve about the same amount of intellectual work. It's just a different way of looking at the problem. So, mindful of time, using ARA allows you to flexibly model the decision-making process of your opponent. And this is something that human beings do all the time. If you go in and ask your boss for a raise, you have a mental model for what the boss values and doesn't value. And if you're able to pitch your contribution in a way that aligns with the boss's system, you win. Otherwise, you lose. And it's all based on a mental model for what's valued. ARA allows you to partition the total uncertainty in the problem into 3 distinct parts. The aleatory uncertainty can be handled by traditional risk analysis. The epistemic uncertainty can be handled by traditional Bayesian analysis. And the concept uncertainty is sort of the new contribution that we have here, in which we work out how to model the decision-making of the opponent. We've described auctions, and the last bit that I raced through was just sort of a general theory for ARA overall. There are interesting results for convoy writing, for the La Relance game, the Borel game, and nicely the ARA finds different solutions that are obtained by traditional methods. And finally, we can open up new research questions where we have an n greater than 2 person game. And it turns out that situations like La Relance, auctions, and really any other type of game structure gets different answers with ARA than you would get from classical game theory. Thank you all very much.
Fred?
So I can imagine doing this in a sequence of repeated games.
Yes.
So what happens there?
In a sequence of repeated games, you learn about your opponent, and there's an interesting situation in which, say, Apollo and Daphne are professional book dealers, and they are going to be bidding against each other in auctions for books on a regular basis. And what might happen is that Apollo might strategically decide to bid low, bid low, bid low for the books he doesn't care about, and then suddenly bid high for the book that he does. And so that's part of a larger game. And so instead of thinking of it as a one-off game, you have to think about it as a set of games, but you can still fold it into this general theory. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're right on schedule, so thank you, David. And we'll now